You're listening to A Mighty Fortress, celebrating 500 years of Lutheranism.
A mighty fortress it is our God, a trusty shield and weapon. He helps us free from
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I'm your host, Knight Jake Zabel. For this episode, we're going to be going through a brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland. See, this year is 2017, the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. However, as many people are not aware, this year is also the 200-year anniversary of the Prussian Union of Churches, which took place in 1817. This Prussian Union of Churches is a very important historical event, as it is what led to the spread of Lutheranism from Europe to places like America and Australia. So, in order to look at the brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland, we need to start with the Prussian Union of Churches. However, the history of Lutheranism in Queensland did not start until 1838. So, I'm going to be doing a brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland, going through all the different divisions and unions of the different Lutheran synodical bodies in this state. Now, this is a brief history, but it is a rather long history, and it is also rather complicated. Therefore, I've decided to break this up into 3 episodes. And on today's episode, we're going to be going through what I've called Part A, which is the years of 1838 to 1900. So we're going to be focusing here on the 19th century. So while the Lutheranism in Australia and also Lutheranism in Queensland started in 1838, our history actually starts back in 1817. So let's begin there. In 1817, King Frederick William III of Prussia sought to unite the Lutherans and the Calvinists, or the Reformed, into a single state church known as the Evangelical State Church of Prussia, or commonly known as the Union Church. This union, known as the Prussian Union of Churches, sought unity, but instead created many more divisions. In 1830, on the 300-year anniversary of the presentation of the Augsburg Confession, the king introduced a new hymnal and a new liturgy into the Union Church, which sought to introduce the Calvinistic, symbolic view of the Lord's Supper into the communion liturgy. The pastors would have a choice of either using the traditional Lutheran liturgy that says, "This is my body, this is my blood," thus confessing the real presence of the Lord's body and blood in the communion. But pastors in the Union Church who came from a more Reformed Calvinist tradition could use a different service of order, which used the words that this only symbolized the body and blood of Jesus, therefore denying the real presence of Jesus in the supper. This did not go down well, and in 1835 this led to what is known as the Old Lutheran Schism, when groups of dissenting confessional Lutherans who held to the pre-Union teachings of the Book of Concord split from the Union Church in order to create a free Lutheran church. These old Lutherans were persecuted, and thus they sought to immigrate outside of Europe. These old Lutherans immigrated to places like America and Australia. But instead of being able to reunite into a single unified Lutheran church, these groups often splintered more and more as outside influences corrupted the church that had once been unified by the Book of Concord. Since the Prussian Union of Churches, the Lutheran Church has been divided into multiple different factions and synods. Both America and Australia have been filled with different Lutheran synodical bodies. And within Australia, no state has suffered more divisions among the Lutherans than the state of Queensland. Thus, this is why I want to focus on a brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland, and thus why I've referred to Queensland as the, quote, state of division. The first Lutherans to arrive in Queensland, and thus also the first Lutherans to arrive in Australia, were the Gosner missionaries, who had arrived in 1838 at Moreton Bay, Queensland. The Gosner missionaries had been trained in a non-denominational Protestant seminary, known as the Gosner Theological College, founded by the Reformed theologian Johannes Gosner. The Lutheran missionaries were sent to Moreton Bay from the Gosnell Theological College on the request of Reverend John Dungmore Lang, a Presbyterian preacher in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. Lang had sought to establish a mission at Moreton Bay to the Aboriginal Australians. Having been unable to find any missionaries, he turned his sights to Gosnell. On July 9th, 1837, the Gosnell missionaries left Germany, and they arrived in Australia at Moreton Bay on January 23rd, 1838. The Gosnell missionaries thus became the first Lutherans of Australia, narrowly beating out Reverend August Carville and the old Lutheran refugees who arrived in Port Adelaide, South Australia, who arrived there on November 20th, 1838, 10 months later. The Gosnell missionaries quickly settled in Moreton Bay and established an Aboriginal mission at a place known as Zion Hills, later renamed German Station, which is now a suburb in Brisbane known as Nunda. In 1844, these men would be joined by a second group of Lutheran missionaries from Gosnell. Yet, by 1848, the mission was abandoned without a single Aboriginal convert to Christianity. Following the failed mission at Zion's Hill, most of the Lutheran missionaries became pastors for the surrounding Protestant churches in Queensland, mainly the Anglicans, Presbyterians and the Baptists. Only a few of the Gosnell missionaries remained Lutheran, heading south to join the flourishing Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria. The hope for Lutheranism in Queensland came in the form of Reverend Carl Frederick Alexander Francis Schurmeister, a Gosnell missionary from the mission to the Maoris on the Catherine Islands off the coast of New Zealand. Due to opposition from the locals and continued illness, Schurmeister had to withdraw from the Catherine Islands. He had intended to return to Germany, his homeland. In 1857, while recovering from illness in Sydney, New South Wales, Pastor Schurmeister was approached by his brother-in-law, Reverend Johann Wilhelm Gericke, a member of the 1844 Gosnell missionaries, and also Reverend Lang. Reverends Gericke and Lang sought the help of Pastor Schurmeister to re-establish the Zion Hills Aboriginal mission. But, realizing that all hope for an Aboriginal mission at Zion's Hill had come to an end, Pastor Schurmeister turned his eyes to the German immigrants of southeast Queensland and sought to bring them into an organised Lutheran church. In 1858, Pastor Schurmeister established the first Lutheran congregation of Queensland, the St. Andrew's Lutheran Congregation of North Brisbane. The congregation originally met in a hired-out Baptist church until 1961 when they built their own church building. From that point on, Lutheranism began to flourish in Queensland. The number of congregations and pastors grew, and as time went on, the congregations began to seek unity among themselves. The Lutherans sought to establish an organised Lutheran synod in Queensland, just as the other states of Australia had done. However, problems arose between the pastors of the more confessionally Lutheran Hermannsburg Mission Seminary and the more confessionally lax Lutherans of the Gosnell Theological College and the Evangelical Mission Society of Basel, commonly called the Basel Mission Society. The main disagreement between the Hermannsburg pastors and the Gosnell Basel pastors was a dispute over the office of the ministry, particularly the roles of the clergy and the roles of the laity. Pastor Schurmeister felt that he fell theologically between the two groups and was often seen as a mediator and middle way. However, due to increased pressure from Pastor Herman Hurlitz of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, Pastor Schurmeister would be forced to pick a side. Pastor Hurlitz was the synodical president of the Victorian Synod and had attempted for many years to establish a Lutheran synod in Queensland in order for the Queensland and Victorian Lutherans to engage in official established fellowship. In 1883, Pastor Johann Gottfried Haussmann, a member of the 1838 Gosnell missionaries, sought membership in the Victorian Synod. Pastor Haussmann had left Queensland in 1855 after the failed Aboriginal mission at Zion's Hill and journeyed to Victoria, where he became a pastor for the Victorian Synod. In 1961, he had returned to his beloved Queensland after Queensland had begun to flourish. Here he formed a congregation in Beenleigh in 1866. He went on to establish further congregations in the surrounding areas. And in the year of 1883, Pastor Houseman and his congregations, known as the Beenleigh Parish, sought membership in the Victorian Synod. The Beenleigh Parish thus became the Queensland branch of the Victorian Synod and thus became the first official Lutheran Synod of Queensland. By 1885, two more Lutheran Synods would join the ranks. For on June 9th, 1885, Pastor Schurmeister, due to pressure from Pastor Hurlitz, would form the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, comprised mostly of the Gosner Basil pastors. In retaliation, the Hermannsburg pastors, who hadn't even been asked to join the Queensland Synod, formed their own synod, the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland, on August 5th, 1885. Pastor Houseman and the Beenleigh Parish would remain part of the Victorian Synod until 1889, when the Queensland Synod joined the Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of Australia, commonly known as the General Synod, in which the Victorian Synod was a member. The General Synod was a collection of Lutheran synodical bodies in Australia, including the Victorian Synod, the Queensland Synod, and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis. The United German and Scandinavian Synod would remain an independent Lutheran Synod until 1910, when they entered into fellowship with the Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Synod, commonly called the Emmanuel Synod, to form the Evangelical Lutheran Church Federation, commonly called the Church Federation. Both the General Synod and the Church Federation were not synods in and of themselves, but they were a conference or a council or collective of synods united together in fellowship. However, returning to the situation in Queensland, as of 1885, there were officially 3 Lutheran synods in the state. The Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, located at Beenleigh Parish, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, and the United German Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. Over the years, many congregations would change from synod to synod. There were also a number of independent Lutheran pastors and congregations in the region, who would eventually join one of the synods in the years to come. And in some cases, many congregations would leave the synods and become independent once again. We have a few cases of particular interest here. One is the Independent German Church of Perth Street, Toowoomba. This congregation had formed in 1864 due to disputes between Pastor Karl August Agner and Pastor Schurmeister. In 1883, the church would call Pastor Joachim Konoki, and in 1885, Konoki and the congregation became founding members of the United German and Scandinavian Synod. However, only a few years later, in 1885, dissension would arise among the congregation, and the congregation would once again become independent. On November 1st of 1885, the United German and Scandinavian Synod erected a new building on Perth Street and dedicated it as Holy Trinity Lutheran Church of the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. However, the trustees of this property took offence at this, as they had intended for it to remain the independent German church. The trustees had desired fellowship with the United German and Scandinavian Synod, but they had not desired membership. Dissension arose, and on September 27th of 1887, Pastor Konoki and a majority of the members left the congregation to join the United German and Scandinavian Synod and built a new building on Hume Street, Toowoomba, which they called Holy Trinity Lutheran Church of the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. As for the trustees, they called Pastor Actham from America to serve them. However, in 1888, Pastor Actham departed and the independent German church ceased to exist, and the property was then sold. Another congregation of interest is the St. John's Congregation of Westbrook, now called Albany. They too were a foundational member of the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod. However, in July of 1886, the congregation broke away from the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod and remained independent until 1909, when they would join with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia. The United German and Scandinavian Synod would face another break in 1889, when, on September 21st, 1889, the Danish members of the Synod would succeed their membership. These Danish members did not form a new synod or organisation, but continued as independent congregations. The Danish congregation suffered much decline and instability, and by 1896 many of the congregations had ceased to exist and many of the Danish pastors had dispersed, either joining one of the Queensland synods or returning back to the homeland of Denmark. At this point in time, the Danish congregation at Kangaroo Point, Brisbane, joined the Scandinavian Lutherans in New Zealand. They called the New Zealand pastor, Pastor Carl George Bjelke Petersen, who just happens to be the father of the famous Queensland politician Johannes Joe Bjelke Petersen. Pastor Bjelke Petersen served the Danish congregation at Kangaroo Point until 1910, when he returned to New Zealand. One more other interesting independent church was the St. John's Independent Lutheran Congregation at Charters Towers, which declared fellowship with the Evangelical State Church of Prussia, or Union Church, in 1896. But returning to the situation of the synods, in 1885, Queensland was home to 3 synods: the Victorian Synod, the Queensland Synod, and the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod. In 1889, Pastor Houseman and the Beenleigh Parish, thus the Victorian Synod, would finally join the Queensland Synod, when the Queensland Synod officially joined the General Synod. This meant that Queensland would be home to only 2 synods: the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland and the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. This is not including St. John's Independent Church Albany or St. John's Independent Lutheran Church Charter Towers or the Danish Lutheran congregations. But before the end of the 1900s, Queensland would gain a 3rd synodical body, for in 1898 Queensland would be home to 3 synodical bodies once again. The Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, or ELSA, had very different origins in Queensland than the other 2 synods. The ELSA, originally called the Bethany Lobethal Synod, was founded in South Australia by Pastor Gotthard Daniel Fritzer in 1846, after the Bethany schism between himself and Pastor August Ludwig Christian Carvel over Carvel's view of the Book of Concord and his promotion of premillennialism. The ELSA managed to spread to Victoria and establish the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia Victorian District. Over the years, the ELSA also sought to establish a foothold in Queensland, and on multiple occasions the ELSA attempted to plant congregations in Queensland. The first attempt happened in 1868. A Hermannsburg-trained pastor of the ELSA, Pastor Carl Gottfried Helmuth, moved from Lobethal, South Australia, to the Logan district in Queensland. A second attempt took place in 1879 when Pastor Gosling of the ELSA moved from the Riverina area in New South Wales to Kirkheim in Queensland, which is now known as modern-day Hagues-Lee. And a third attempt would take place in 1883 when the ELSA called 4 seminarians from the Hermannsburg Mission Seminary to assist Pastor Gosling in Queensland. Before these men headed to Queensland, they preached in the ELSA congregations around Adelaide and shared in communion fellowship with the ELSA. And that, however, none of these 3 attempts eventuated into an ELSA congregation in Queensland. For, in those early days of Australia, it was too difficult for the ELSA Synod to provide support and fellowship across the vast Australian countryside. Henceforth, since those above-mentioned pastors of the ELSA could not receive support while in Queensland, they turned their allegiances elsewhere. All 6 of these former ELSA pastors joined Pastor Saltman in 1885 in forming the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. The ELSA was just unable to develop another district in Queensland. What they needed was to find an already established synod in the state. Thus, in 1889, the Elsa Victorian district sought to establish union with the United German Scandinavian Synod, as it was much easier in those days to interact between Queensland and Victoria, as we have seen in the fellowship of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria. Hopes were high for the Victorian district of the Elsa, as both the Elsa and the United German Lutheran Synod pastors had received their training from Hermannsburg. In addition to this, several of the founding pastors of the United German and Scandinavian Synod were former pastors of the Elsa. It seemed that a union between the two synods was a guarantee. However, despite this supposed guarantee, a union would never form. In 1889, a gathering took place in South Brisbane between the pastors of the United German Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland and the Elsa's Victorian district. Here, the two synods would discuss the possibility of a union. At the meeting, a resolution was passed declaring that the Elsa and the United German Scandinavian Synod would take steps towards a union. However, this South Brisbane resolution, as I shall call it, was prevented from being carried out, as it appeared that the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synodical President, Pastor Saltman, was opposed to a union with the Elsa. This was due to the Elsa's fellowship with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which had been established in 1887. Pastor Saltman had particular issues with the Elsa Missouri Synod view of the doctrine of election. And due to Pastor Saltman, the Elsa was once again foiled in their attempts to establish a foothold in the state of Queensland. However, many members of the United German and Scandinavian Synod were sympathetic with the Elsa's doctrinal stance, and this sympathy would allow the Elsa to finally establish a firm foothold in the state of Queensland. In 1897, the United German and Scandinavian Synod congregation at Highfields would call Pastor Backen. Pastor Backen was an Elsa pastor currently serving in Nini, Victoria. Pastor Backen accepted the call, but only on one condition. That condition was that the Highfields congregation become an official member of the Elsa. The congregation would accept the condition, and thus, in 1898, Christchurch Lutheran Church Highfields became the first Elsa congregation in Queensland. However, this was not an easy situation, as in 1899, dissension arose among the members over the Missouri Synod tendencies of the Elsa. Many members of Christchurch Lutheran congregation left and built the Holy Trinity Lutheran Church at Highfields. The Holy Trinity congregation would return to the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland and call back their former pastor, Pastor Berghardt, who was currently serving a congregation at German Station, formerly known as Zion's Hill. The Holy Trinity building was dedicated in 1900 and Pastor Berghardt began services to the congregation. This now brings us to the end of the 1800s. As we finish up this video and round off the 19th century, I'd like to give an update of the state of Lutheranism in the state of Queensland. At this point in time, Queensland was divided into 6 groups. The first being the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, which was a member of the Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of Australia. The second group was the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. The third group was the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, which was in fellowship with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The other 3 divisions of Lutheranism in Queensland at this point were independent congregations. Thus, the 4th division in Queensland was St. John's Independent Lutheran Congregation at Albany. The 5th division was the St. John's Independent Lutheran Congregation at Charter Towers, which was in fellowship with the Evangelical State Church of Prussia, also known as the Union Church. And the 6th division was the Danish Lutheran Congregation at Kangaroo Point, Brisbane, which was a member congregation of the Synod known as the Scandinavian Lutherans in New Zealand. This wraps up the history of Lutheranism in Queensland for the 1800s. I hope you can join me again for our next episode, where we will begin our history of the Lutheran Church of Queensland in the 1900s. I've been your host, Knight Jake. Thanks for listening, goodbye, and God bless.